Okay, thank you. My name's Steve Piccolo. I'm going to be presenting, and also I'll be at the end of my presentation. Amanda Warren, who is an undergraduate researcher in my lab, will jump in and present the last few slides. Okay, let's see. Oops, that's not what we want. Okay, there we go. Okay, so a data repository that I often use in my research is called Gene Expression Omnibus. Many of you have probably used it or visited this website. And this is a result of policies from funding agencies and journals that require authors to submit their data, high throughput molecular data, in a publicly available repository so that other people can come along and verify their findings and potentially build on their research. And as of just recently, there were more than 250,000 different data series or data sets that have resulted from research that are included in this repository. So it's a really great opportunity to do interesting work like validate experimental findings, perform meta-analyses where you combine data sets, multiple data sets together to make inferences, train machine learning models on multiple data sets, and just generally build on prior investments. One of the challenges is because there is so much data and because there are relatively few constraints on the process of how the data sets are described, it can be difficult to find relevant data sets that are relevant to a particular research question that you might be working on. GEO, or Gene Expression Omnibus, does have support keyword or ontology-based searches that you can use. So if we were to go to the website and let's say we were interested in studying Down syndrome, we could put that term in the search box and it would bring up a page like this that would show us that there are almost 3,000 results. We can filter those down somewhat in that we can indicate that we're specifically looking for a data series or a complete collection of data, not just individual samples. We can say we're looking specifically for gene expression data or data from humans. So when I put those criteria in, it gave me 85 data sets that may be interesting for the topic that I'm studying. However, based on experience, I can say that many of these will probably not be super relevant to the topic that I'm studying, and there will probably be many that this search process didn't identify out of those that are out there. And part of this is because keyword-based searches are somewhat limited. They don't necessarily reflect the semantics of the underlying data sets or the text that they're representing. For example, it may not be able to recognize that glioblastoma is a form of brain tumor, or that an E. coli infection is a type of bacterial infection. Or if you put in the word bipolar or the term bipolar disorder, it might also pull up data sets related to bipolar spindles or bipolar neurons or things like that. Okay, so there's potential to improve on that. One great thing that we do have in GEO is for each data set, there is a human language description, or actually several descriptions about the study design, information about how the data were collected and processed and things like that. And so there are advantages in having that there. However, these descriptions are largely unstructured, and because researchers describe things in different ways, it can be difficult to sort of just using a keyword-based search, be able to identify what all of that text means and be able to identify data sets that are relevant to a certain topic. So the technique that we use to try to address this problem are language models, which is probably no surprise given the many talks that we've heard on this topic. But we wanted to use language models to characterize each data set based on their English language descriptions that have been provided. So the general idea is to take those descriptions, and for each of those data sets, we would use some type of a pre-trained language model, and we would generate an embedding or a vector of numbers for each data set that represents the semantics of that data set in a vector of a particular size. Okay, and then the kind of envisioning how this might be used by a regular researcher, we thought that a researcher would potentially use the GEO search tool or maybe do a literature search to identify some data sets that were relevant to a particular topic that they wanted to study. And then the next thing they would do is, we would create embeddings based on those data sets that they had identified as being relevant. We would treat this as a reference set. And then we would use a distance metric to rank other geo data sets based on semantic similarity to those reference data sets. So those would also be created as embeddings. Okay, and then for our research study to kind of evaluate the potential to use this type of approach, we used annotations that are human curated. For about 10% of geo, there are annotations in this database called GEMMA, where they've assigned tags to each data set in their repository and said, this data set is related to Down syndrome or bipolar disorder or whatever it is. We wanted to kind of get a feel for using both older models and also some of the newer transformer-based models, what kind of potential there was for using those models to characterize the text and identify data sets that are relevant to a certain topic. So we evaluated embedding models that ranged from small, they used relatively small embeddings, maybe as few as 300 numbers in each vector, up to embeddings that had more than 4,000 numbers in each vector. We also had a range of corpora that were used to train these models. So some were trained on biomedical corpora, others were trained on general scientific text, and then others were trained on just general text that wasn't necessarily specific to biomedicine or science. From GEMMA, we narrowed things down a little bit, and we focused on 6 medical conditions that range from being less studied, so like juvenile idiopathic arthritis is less studied, up to those that were more commonly studied, like Parkinson's disease and neuroblastoma. What we found was that we were able to identify relevant data sets better for some of these medical conditions than others. This didn't necessarily correspond to how commonly or not commonly each of those medical conditions was studied. So we had more success with Parkinson's disease and Down syndrome, and less success with neuroblastoma and triple negative breast cancer. We think for neuroblastoma, part of the challenge is that there are cell lines from neuroblastoma originally derived from neuroblastoma patients. And so a lot of times we identified studies that had used those cell lines, but weren't necessarily relevant to neuroblastoma as a medical condition. That's just one example. Okay, and this slide just shows kind of at a high level what we found across those 30 different models. And I'm not showing the names of the models, but just kind of to give you an idea of how they performed. What we found was that, so the best ones are to the left. What we found was that a few models performed better than others, but generally the trend was that the larger the embedding size, the better it performed, a model performed. And that relationship was statistically significant, but there's a little bit of a confounding factor there because some of the models that use larger embeddings use some of the more recently developed technologies for generating embeddings. We did see some patterns associated with the data source type. So the best performing models, you can see up at the top, they all were trained on general corpora rather than biomedical specific or science specific corpora. But that relationship actually wasn't statistically significant. The top 3 performing models, we'll focus on those mostly here. So they were all transformer-based models, and they were all trained using contrastive learning strategies. So essentially the idea is that it uses labels either generated using supervised approaches or it used a supervised approach or a self-supervised approach to try to push together items that are similar in a vector space and push apart items that are dissimilar from each other. So this was one commonality across those models that tended to perform the best. Digging in a little bit more into these results, this graph is showing a comparison against what we found if we did a geo search using the geo search tool itself. And we did 3 different variations of that. I won't go into the details about that, but we do have a preprint if anybody's interested in that. And what we found was that, so on the x-axis here, it's showing that if you look through the top 5 or 10 or up to 1,000 ranked data sets that this methodology identifies, for most of these medical conditions, eventually you'll identify most or all of the relevant data sets. So if you're willing to sift through enough search results, you'll eventually find most of the data sets that have been deemed by curators to be relevant to whatever medical condition it is that you're studying. One challenge we found with the geo searches is that often they returned a relatively small number of results, so maybe 50 to 100 results in many cases. And so in a few cases that captured all of the relevant data sets, but often it fell short of being able to identify all of the relevant data sets. So you may have to do an additional search using additional keywords and that kind of thing. Okay, so our conclusion is that we think that large language models do have strong potential to aid with data set finding, and we think that they can be used in complement to existing tools, both first using existing tools to find some relevant data sets and using those as a reference for finding more. But also one thing that we found was that the top ranked data sets for both of these methods often did not overlap very much, so suggesting that we can gain something by using both types of searches or find more if we combine both of them. A couple of caveats, the models that performed poorly here may perform really well in other contexts, and I'm sure there are other models that we didn't test that would perform better than the ones we selected. We just wanted to get a general idea of where modern language models, how effective they might be in this context. Okay.
Okay, so in order for researchers to be able to use this tool, we created a web app called GeoFinder, which can search and filter geoseries using the language model. It uses a ChromoDB vector database and the GTE large language model, which was the best out of the 30 that we tested. And we're hopeful that this can be a tool for researchers as they perform transcriptomic studies that rely on multiple data sets to be able to find relevant data more quickly and efficiently. So here's an example. We can walk you through how you would use GeoFinder. If we go back to our initial search in Geo for Down syndrome, we can select these little blue check boxes for the data sets that we're interested in. And then at the top of the page, you will select Send To and create a text file that will export all the information on Geo of these data sets for Down syndrome. Then here in the app of GeoFinder, you have this text box where you can either manually enter your GSC IDs or click on the paperclip to upload that text file that we just created. At this point, any researcher could also select by experiment type, so whether that be expression profiling by high throughput sequencing or by array. You can also choose one of the top 15 species that are found on the Geo database, as well as number of samples and year of publication. In our research analysis, we only used human and mouse transcriptomic data, but on the website, there are more species represented. So then the GeoFinder web app will parse and populate the text box with the IDs from the data file, where they can be manually entered. You'll be all good to click submit. After submitting those IDs, you'll be presented with a table of the top results, the top 100 results that presents the information that's found on the Geo website, as well as a hyperlink all the way on the left that will link you back to the original Geo site. So this is a QR code that links to the website, and we're hopeful that it will be useful to you all, that you can use it, and also send us feedback. We have contact information on the webpage. We're very open to suggestions for new features and improvements. In closing, we'd just like to acknowledge the National Institutes of Health for funding and supporting this project, as well as students and collaborators from BYU and the University of British Columbia. Thank you.
We can take a few questions.
So you did all of your testing on human diseases or human medical conditions, and where I can imagine your training sets might have a big impact on that kind of question versus I want to find things that have at least a 4-fold increase, or I want to find things that use this platform, or I want to find things that have these two bacteria, but not that one. Do you have any thoughts about how you could go from here to?
So are you saying dig deeper into the metadata to be able to, that's collected during the submission process, or do you mean parsing that kind of information from the text-based descriptions?
Well, so maybe I misunderstood how it works. You have a language model, which you've trained, and then you're using that to support queries. Are the queries, the queries are then open, you're not processing the text in the metadata, right?
So what we're doing is we're taking the descriptions that are in the data set level metadata where the authors, the people who submitted the data, they've submitted these descriptions. It's like a couple of paragraphs.
Free form.
Yeah, free form. We're taking that, we're generating an embedding from that, and we're saying, let's go out and identify a few data sets that are relevant to whatever topic we want to study. And then we say, we believe there are more out there that are similarly described to these. So our language model is going out and saying, give me other data sets that are described using similar language.
So you have to have example data sets. Mm-hmm. It's not just getting the language model to find.
No, but I think if I understand your question, I think there is potential to do something like what you're saying, where you could do like a zero-shot learning kind of approach, where you could say, I'm going to type up a phrase or a question of what I'm looking for, and then a language model could go and look for data sets that kind of are semantically similar to that question that you're asking or that description.
Yeah, and then your evaluation question would be, which kinds of models are good at catching this kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's something we've thought about for future steps, but we haven't gone that far yet.
I'll watch the space.
Okay, great. Thank you.